Yo, what's going on? It is Apollo. Welcome back to my domain. I'm gonna keep it very sweet and simple. Shout out to Neptune for helping me plan this out, and let's get on to the video. I still don't have an intro. Now, Luffy, he was always considered to be an odd child, to say the very least. One of the very first things that stood out about Luffy was, well, his eyes. For some reason, he had purple eyes with multiple rings within them. Some people would actually comment on how they would get lost in his eyes from time to time. They were kind of creepy as well. Something that also stood out about Luffy was his rather high intelligence. For a 7-year-old, he seemed to pick up on things rather quickly. He'd usually hang out at Makino's bar when he was bored, so, well, fairly often actually. And eventually, a group of pirates, they would actually find themselves in the East Blue, hanging around Makino's bar as well. The captain seemed to take a liking to the woman. And Luffy, he didn't like the attention that Shanks was getting from Makino, because it meant that he was getting less attention in return. This would cause for him to, well, get into a couple of arguments with the man from time to time. And of course, Shanks never took Luffy all that seriously. Instead, Shanks, he would either be drinking, telling stories about his travels as a pirate on the Grand Line, or both. Yeah, these stories Shanks told about the Great Seas left Luffy enamored though. He was also introduced to a girl with like two-tone hair, red and white. She was around his age, and she was apparently part of Shanks' crew. Or Shanks' crew, I should say. Her name was, well, Uta, and seeing her on the crew immediately made Luffy believe that he had a chance of also being able to join. At least Shanks on his travels as a pirate before maybe journeying on his own, but the man would always refuse. Uta was practically born on the crew, so, well, she was an exception. And Uta would always make fun of Luffy as well, bragging about how she was better than him because of that. And, well, it would rile Luffy up quite a bit, and this would usually end up turning into, well, fights. Usually in good fun though, at the end of the day, never too serious. Luffy did win most of their games though, which that did annoy Uta. He could somehow always see past their tricks for some reason, and eventually Uta seemingly vanished out to thin air with no real explanation given by Shanks. Luffy chose not to question it though. He could already tell that, well, there was a bit of a gloomy aura in, well, the crew, so that was his main reason for not trying to bring it up all that often. Shanks would continue to tell stories though about his adventures, and Shanks would also continue to, well, encourage Luffy to become a pirate and to train hard to become one as well. He would also comment on Luffy's eyes, and he would even bring up how they were special. There was something special about these eyes that Luffy would eventually find out. Luffy didn't really know what Shanks meant by that until, well, there was one incident with a group of mountain bandits. Led by this one guy. His name was Higuma the Bear. He walked around like he owned the place and practically spat in the face of the pirates all around. He treated Shanks with complete and utter disrespect despite the courtesy of offering the man a bottle after apologizing for finishing the rest of the sake. Shanks treated us if it wasn't a big deal, but Luffy, he was riled up from this. He could feel his eyes begin to itch and his blood begin to boil. He didn't know why, but two words suddenly popped into his head at that moment. He walked towards Higuma and stretched out his arms. Higuma, when seeing the boy, simply laughed though. He mocked Luffy's eyes for how strange they looked and acted as if he wasn't worth his time. But Luffy, he muttered two words though, and that was what made all the difference. Almighty push. These two words seemingly triggered a reaction. Higuma suddenly was sent flying out to the bar. His men began to panic seeing this and ran to see if he was alright. Higuma's rib cage was caved inwards. He needed immediate medical attention. Shanks and his crew, they were just all left in shock, surprised to see what happened here. Did Luffy really do that? At first, Shanks was about to jump the gun and finally accept Luffy's request to join his crew, but after the initial shock, he began to think more clearly. He realized that the boy was probably going to need training to handle what he believed to be a devil fruit. Unfortunately, there wasn't much Shanks could even really teach Luffy, considering how he didn't have any devil fruit to call his own. All he could do was encourage Luffy to continue to practice with his newfound abilities, so he could gain a good control over them. After Shanks and his crew departed, Luffy would have ended up taking the redhead's words to heart. His training at first consisted of him getting thrown into the forest though by his grandfather Garp. He would also receive bursts of love a lot, but after some time, Luffy just began to develop his own version of it as well, and this would genuinely surprise Garp. He would have never expected someone as young as Luffy to actually develop Haki, especially this way. Now Garp was even more invested in his grandson's development. He didn't like the fact the boy was so obsessed with being a pirate though. He honestly blamed Shanks for being a bad influence on his grandson. He wished he was there more often, and he would end up having Luffy, stay with a group of mountain bandits that actually owed him a favor, you see. They were already taking care of another boy that Garp dropped off for them, so they weren't all that pleased to see him bringing in another child. The leader, the Don, would initially refuse to take in Luffy, but Garp would go on to threaten them by, taking them into the Marines. She would bite her tongue in response and be forced to take in Luffy. She would let this be known though from early on when it came on to Luffy. They weren't his parents or anything, so he would have to fend for himself while living with them, making himself useful as well. That included getting food for himself. Her example would have actually been Ace, the boy that they were previously raising, suddenly bringing in a dead animal for the mountain bandits to cook. He had hunted the wild animal himself, and Luffy was, left with nothing. He was forced to quickly adapt to these new surroundings, and Luffy would go hunting for food while also trying to befriend Ace meanwhile. The older boy would simply try to avoid Luffy like a plague though, even setting up traps from time to time, and Luffy would discover new abilities during this time as well. Almighty Push and Almighty Pull, they would also, be the main abilities he would have been using. Almighty Pull would have been the other ability that he had unlocked during his time while hunting, and it was very useful. You see, even the biggest of animals like a tiger were simply just no match for Luffy when he was using these two moves alone. The only issues were that they initially drained a large amount of stamina from Luffy, and there seemed to be a cooldown period for when he could next use the abilities. Despite those issues that he faced though, he would go on to, prove himself to be a great asset towards the mountain bandits, and Ace would also eventually warm up to Luffy after the boy defended him and his friend Sabo from the Blue Jam pirates. Luffy had proven to be a loyal and trustworthy person from that day forward, and he was also incredibly strong, being able to knock out the Blue Jam pirates with, relative ease. It was honestly surprising to the older boys when they first saw it. Luffy would continue to grow in power and abilities from that day forward, and Luffy's bond with the two boys would also continue to grow to the point that they would call each other brothers. Luffy's name would become well known throughout Dawn Island. With one of his most recent abilities, it had honestly become far too hard to ignore. His presence. Yeah, you see, he was summoning giant animals with the same type of eyes as him that were practically immortal after all. So yeah, sometimes you would see him soaring through the sky on a giant bird with Ace and Sabo. Other times you would see him riding through the forest, bulldozing the whole forest on a giant bull, usually accompanied by Ace and Sabo as well. They had effectively become the most feared group of kids on Dawn Island. No one could lay a finger on Luffy. Even with the reveal of Sabo being from a noble family and his father's attempts to retrieve him, they proved to be fruitless in the end. Sabo's father would have attempted to use the likes of the Blue Gem Pirates in order to actually retrieve Sabo, but that only served as a way for Luffy to further display his strength. For you see, Luffy was the one to actually end up disbanding the Blue Jam Pirates in the end because of the fact that he was just that powerful, and the Blue Jam Pirates, they had been embarrassed by a kid. They could no longer show their faces on Dawn Island, and they would be forced to disband as well. The nobles found Luffy to actually be rather annoying. He was a nuisance, but a nuisance that they weren't really able to do anything about. For you see, the world government, they weren't going to get involved with the actions of a child, since he technically was not breaking any laws most of the time. And of course, they were forced to simply endure Luffy and his brother's presence until they all grew up. I mean, after all, the most that Luffy was really doing was probably just vandalizing a couple of things, but that was something that the world government didn't really see worth really getting involved with, sending their marines after Luffy or anything. These guys, they just saw them as kids, and Luffy and his brothers, they would all turn 17, and soon afterwards, they would all leave Dawn Island one by one. They would go off to, start their own adventures. Luffy's adventure would just so happen to start with him flying on one of his famous giant animals across the sea before, deciding to land on a pirate ship of sorts. People would immediately begin panicking when seeing such a giant, strange-looking creature just suddenly land on board their ship. They were in the middle of robbing another ship of their assets too, so this was rather inconvenient for them to deal with right now. Luffy would simply chuckle hearing all of the commotion though being made over one of his pets. At least that's what he called them. He would hop off with a bird and introduce himself to the pirates, declaring that he was going to be the future pirate king. The crewmates, they wanted to laugh hearing this, but Luffy's strange eyes instead gave them a shudder. It just screamed power, and there was something ominous about these eyes as well. It didn't help that the bird also had the same eyes as Luffy, and these two, when looking at the eyes, many would put two and two together and realize that they were connected in some form or manner, but they weren't exactly sure how. Luffy's stomach would begin to growl though, and he would immediately question whether anyone had any food that he could, eat. He didn't get a response at first though, and the captain of the ship, Alvida, would simply try to attack him instead. She didn't care that he had some stupid big bird with him either. She was, not she. He was on her ship, trying to make demands like he owned the place. That wasn't how she rolled at all. Luffy would question why a whale was well on board though, striking a chord with Alvida when realizing he was referring to her. She would try to attack Luffy multiple times after that, but Luffy would simply mechanize his arm before shooting some missiles at her. This would surprise a group of pirates even more. The captain would have been blasted into the sky too, and Luffy would question why everyone was just staring at him though when he was done with Alvida, as if he didn't just shoot missiles out of his arm. Yeah, the crew would be speechless after that, and Luffy's stomach, it would just continue to growl after that as well. He would continue to ask once more, if anyone had any food on them. A stowaway though, a stowaway girl with orange hair, actually saw Luffy's display of power and realized that this would be a perfect time to actually exploit him, getting him to be on her side for now. She didn't know how this guy was able to do what he did, but he seemed strong, and that was all that really mattered right about now. It would be best to get on his good side, and she would find some food that was stashed away in some barrels on the cruise ship and bring them over to Alvida's ship. She would introduce herself to Luffy as well, Nami, and hand over the food rations. Luffy would show gratefulness on his face as he began to indulge on the food. It wasn't the most appetizing food out there, but it served its purpose. Nami would then go on to ask for a bit of a favor from Luffy, you see. And that little favor was to simply accompany him for some of his journey. She wasn't planning to be with Luffy for very long, just for as long as he was useful being around. Of course, with his rather incredible abilities. Luffy would agree to the rather simple request though after she did feed him. It was the least that he could do in this situation, and it wasn't really that big of a deal either. He honestly didn't know why he didn't pick any food rations from beforehand, but he supposed that his hindsight was 20/20 though. Luffy would question what he ought to do with the Alvida pirates though, to which the crew would show an immense amount of fear, rightfully so. Many would beg for mercy after seeing how easily Luffy took down their boss, and it seemed as if he had more abilities under his sleeve as well, so they didn't want to risk it, yeah. And Nami would suggest simply, sinking their ship for now, or well, another option could be to just take their ship. Either or, it didn't really matter to her. Luffy would decide to go with the latter here, unsummoning his bird, surprising everyone once more. So, the bird was really connected to Luffy. Interesting. Luffy would announce that he was the new captain of the ship, and from here on out, they would listen to his orders. The crew members, they would have no issue with this whatsoever. It was better than the former option of simply being forced to fend for themselves while, holding onto a plank in the middle of the ocean, or, possibly dying. Luffy would order for the men to set sail for the nearest island, and that island just so happened to be Shelltown. It was home to the Navy base. Yeah. So, Luffy, he actually showed little to no care whatsoever though. He would order for his men to stay behind and watch the ship while he explored the place. Nami would offer to accompany him, to which he had no issue with. As long as she didn't weigh him down, that is. The two would go about exploring the place and, well, split up eventually. Luffy would find himself being drawn towards the center of the island though, where he encountered a green-haired fellow being forced to endure the hot, sizzling sun while being tied up. It seemed like he was under marine jurisdiction as well. A little girl would actually climb a ladder and enter the premises, offering the green-haired man some rice balls, to which the green-haired fellow would refuse, telling her to scram, essentially. And Luffy, he found this behavior to be rather distasteful.
His opinion of this guy was already beginning to sour. That would change though when a man with blonde hair and several Marines actually entered. The blonde had a pompous attitude and treated the girl like she was beneath him. He squashed the girl's rice balls to the ground for crying out loud. They even ordered the Marine soldiers to throw this little girl out of their premises. They didn't know why Marines would even listen to this guy. Was this really what his grandfather put up with throughout the years? And he wanted Luffy to experience the same sort of torture? Yeah, he was not about to be under the world government's control anytime soon if that were the case. You see, Luffy would be surprised by the green-haired fellow's actions afterwards, so he would ask for a favor from Luffy, and that was for Luffy to actually feed him one of the rice balls that the girl had made. When Luffy climbed over the fence and inspected the rice balls, though, he would mention how they were covered in dirt, though. Zoro would explain that he didn't really care. You see, the girl had made these rice balls for him, so he was going to eat them. Luffy would do so and realize that this guy was actually a big softie that just wanted the best for the girl. He even asked for Luffy to tell the girl that he thought the rice balls were delicious. Yeah, it was official. Luffy would declare that Zoro was going to be part of his crew. Initially, Zoro refused, but Luffy, being Luffy, he would refuse his refusal. Zoro would actually comment on how he still had some time left being tied up here before he could be freed. The sentence was also to make sure that the little girl didn't suffer either, because of the pompous Drake thinking he could do whatever he wanted since his dad was a Marine captain here. Luffy would ponder on what Zoro said before coming up with an idea. Simply put, destroy the base. Yeah, Zoro would be confused by what Luffy meant until he saw the boy suddenly summon a series of giant animals that all attacked the base. Zoro was aghast. Of all the things he had expected from today, this was not one of them. He supposed from this day forward, Luffy was going to be his captain. And yeah, that's basically it. This is Apollo. I'm telling y'all to get out of my domain. Yeah, I'm tired of y'all now. Peace. Oh, but also, before I forget, well, I did forget earlier, but I didn't mention this. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe in order to help with the algorithm. Yeah, get out to my domain. I'm done.